Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today in this powerful conversation about understanding what anti-Semitism is, what anti-Semitism isn't, and how to make sense of how anti-Semitism fits into the landscape of the broader social justice movements and white supremacy as a whole. We're so thankful to have you all here. My name is Rabbi Jenna Shah, and I use the pronouns they and them, and I am the Associate Director of Israel Campaigns and Education here at Trua, where I am supporting and running our work around this war with Israel and Gaza. So much of our narrative and our Jewish tradition teaches that the world was created through words. Words have the power to create worlds, and words have the power to destroy worlds. And we're so thankful today to have two experts to help us understand the power of words to create and destroy words, and the importance of ensuring that all people have the ability to use their words to speak up and use their rights to free speech. Trua is a human rights organization representing over 2,300 rabbis and cantors in North America. This is where most of the response to the war is housed, including our response to events as they occur, and organizing and supporting rabbis and cantors to be a public moral voice. So much of how we are understanding our role in this moment is to uplift nuance, and that's what we hope to do today. Because so many of us are feeling raw emotions and our emotions are running high, we've decided to disable the public chat for today. Our emotions matter. They matter a lot. They're part of what makes us human. So I make no judgment on any reactions you might have today or to any of our other webinars that we might have. But there are too many ways a chat can be misunderstood or fired off quickly. So we want to make sure that everyone is safe. Please do use the chat to send any questions to the meeting co-hosts. Rabbi Matt Dreffin, who's our tech co-host today, thank you. And we will send them off to our teachers today. This webinar is being recorded and closed captioning is available if you would like it. So you can select that option in Zoom if you need it. And if you have any other access needs, feel free to send them our
I think Jenna froze. So Eric, maybe we should just jump in since we know each other well enough while we're waiting for them to come back.
Absolutely. Good morning, Rabbi Jacobs. How are you? I am thinking about you and yours.
Thank you, and good morning. It's good to see you. Eric and I were also on taping a segment yesterday for NBC on some of these very issues. So we've fortunately or unfortunately had the opportunity to talk about anti-Semitism in Israel quite a lot over the last day, but this is of course the moment over the last many weeks. I want to say before we jump in, Eric reminded me yesterday that actually in 2017, in February 2017, Trua organized a conference for rabbis pretty soon after the inauguration. We had a couple of hundred rabbis come on a conference that was planned in a few weeks. And it was one of the first times. I mean, Eric and I have known each other for a very long time, and I knew that he is an expert in anti-Semitism, but I think you were saying it was one of the first times or the first time that you had really spoken publicly in that kind of setting. And it was right. And I do remember that you walked in and you said, I'm working on this article. It's going to come out soon. I think you're going to like it. And then pretty soon after that, you came out with this article, Skin in the Game on anti-Semitism, which has become, I would like to say, kind of a contemporary classic. It really has just blown up and gotten around and just been such a crucial intervention in the conversation about anti-Semitism. So first of all, thank you so much for that. And second, it's just really always a pleasure to be here and to be able to, I really want everybody to hear your voice. So I'm really glad that we can be in this conversation together.
It's an honor. It was actually the first time that I spoke public facing around this intersection of the rise of white nationalism, which at the time was still Rabbi Jacobs. You may remember this is much before Charlottesville, and there was still much denial within the human rights, racial justice, and progressive movements about the rise of a social movement engaged in exclusion. In fact, we often ignored it or made fun of it. And it was the first time that I talked about this intersection of anti-Semitism, white nationalism, and the impact that those two things combined could have on the gains of civil rights here in the United States, and the global impact that that also would carry. I'm saddened that today we are revisiting that conversation, but it does seem to be an important conversation to revisit in this moment.
Thanks. And I think we got Jenna back. So Jenna, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Yes, thank you. The joys of Zoom and technology
Yeah.
in this moment. Thank you both for being here. It seems like we had a really wonderful introduction. And I'm curious, as a way of getting us started today, I'd love for you each to take a few minutes and just briefly explain how you conceptualize anti-Semitism and how we are seeing it play out in this moment. Eric, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Rabbi Jill.
Absolutely. So we should understand that anti-Semitism is one form of anti-Jewish bigotry. Anti-Jewish hatred is one of the oldest forms of consistent bigotry in the world. It is only outdated by one other form: misogyny, the hatred of women. Uh, Hatred against Jews has taken on different forms and manifestations over time. But the one that I'm focused on presently is the rise of anti-Semitism, right? And I want to be clear because often folks hear anti-Semitism, they think Semitic, and they often ask me, well, aren't Jews and Arabs Semitic? And the answer to that is no, that is not true, right? Neither Jews or Arabs are Semitic. Semitic is a language group and not a people. And the term anti Semitism was not coined by Jews, but those who sought to find a justification to oppress Jews. And so while we may be uncomfortable with the term anti Semitism, the fault does not lie with the Jewish community around the coining of that phrase. In the same way as if you do not like the word race or racism, do not go around blaming people of color. We did not coin that term either. Speak to those who sought to oppress people and to come up with justifications through the coinage of the term anti Semitism. Anti Semitism develops in the early 1900s, and it's a distinct form of anti Jewish bigotry. It places Jews not as a religious or cultural other, but as a racialized other. Now, this is not completely new in the lines of anti-Jewish bigotry, but it becomes the dominant form of anti-Jewish bigotry. It is captured and capsulized within a narrative, as most forms of bigotry are. And in this case, in the early 1900s, it is encapsulated by a story called The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. It is developed in the early 1900s. It is spread by Russian secret police who are afraid of revolution in Russia and Western Europe. It seeks to displace the frustrations and the anxieties, right, of people who are living as feudal class against the royalty in Russia and Western Europe. It seeks to scapegoat Jews and to allow Jews become the buffer between the haves and the have-nots. It does so by telling an anti-Semitic story about meeting of Jewish leaders who meet in a cemetery at midnight to plot the takeover and destruction of European Christendom. In fact, today, the Great Replacement theory, listening to neo-Nazis chant, Jews will not replace us, is formulated as the Protocols 2.0. The protocols blame Jews for every calamity on the planet at the time, every frustration, and accuse Jews of trying to take over the major forms of power, politics, culture, economy. Rabbi Shah, I'll sum it up this way, as I wrote, and I will summarize what I wrote in Skin in the Game. Anti-Semitism isn't at the core of white nationalism. The idea that the United States should be an all-white nation free of people of color and Jews. It is the core of white nationalism. In the way that anti-blackness is the paper upon which white supremacy is written, anti-Semitism is the paper upon which white nationalism is written. And it is so central to white nationalism that I became convinced that people of color and other marginalized groups will never win our freedom if we're not also active in the struggle to uproot this form of anti-Jewish hate and this narrative. It's because amongst 21st century white nationalists, Jews are cast in the same role that they've always filled for anti-Semites, as the absolute other, demons stirring a pot of lesser evils and the driving force behind white dispossession. And at the foundation of that modern movement is an explicit claim that Jews are a separate race and that their ostensible position as white is nothing more than the greatest trick the devil has ever played, i.e., another Jewish conspiracy. For white nationalists and other anti-Semites who orient towards that narrative, Jews, despite and indeed because of the fact that they are seen as white, are an enemy race that must be exposed and eliminated. For white nationalists, it is that fantasy of invisible Jewish power that explains how Black Americans, a race of supposed inferiors, how we could orchestrate the end of Jim Crow, how feminists and the LGBTQ community could upend traditional gender roles, and how workers could mount a challenge to global inequality. When folks ask me, where is that anti-Semitism in the white nationalist movement? My response is, it's everywhere. When the Tree of Life shooter said Jews were committing a genocide against white people, he was using language that was intimately familiar to his fellow white nationalists. And it is that rabid anti-Semitism that is the framework in which the entire movement functions. And it is not just Jews who have paid the cost of that anti-Semitic narrative. Black shoppers in a Buffalo supermarket who were killed by a mass shooter were killed by a murderer who believed that he was in a war with Jews. Certainly were those worshipers killed in a Black church in South Carolina, Latino shoppers in a Walmart in El Paso, and Latinos and their families visiting a garlic festival in Gilroy, California. In many of the mission-oriented hate violence that occurs in this country, at the core is anti-Semitism. But the truth is anti-Semitism does not exist in a vacuum. Any organizer, including white nationalists, cannot organize people around something that does not already exist. In summary, white nationalists don't bring anti-Semitism to our communities, to our movements, and to our institutions. They merely organize the anti-Semitism that already exists. The first line of defense against white nationalism is to admit that anti-Semitism exists on both the conscious and unconscious level, like all forms of violence. Now, I grew up as a racial justice activist. That is who I am. I am an anti-racist. And the one thing that I understand as an anti-racist is to refuse to deal with any ideology of domination, is to abet it. And I believe that in this moment, understanding how anti-Semitism functions allows us to have the serious debates and conversations and movements that we need to have in this moment on Israel and Palestine and Gaza without animating the force of white nationalism. And if we do not do that, we should understand that we are creating potential long-term consequences. This is a time for serious leadership, and we cannot have serious leaders who do not understand how anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-Arab racism function in American society. It's like trying to have a conversation on crime without understanding the legacy of anti-Black racism in this country. It is impossible, and the harm has been very clear from the level and the rise of hate crimes amongst targeting Muslims, targeting Jews, targeting those who are perceived to be Jewish and Muslim is completely unacceptable. And leaders who are out there promoting rhetoric without understanding anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-Arab racism are contributing to this environment. We are partly responsible for this rise in hate violence, for the divide of a united front against authoritarianism in this country. And in short, I am calling for serious leadership to stand up and to help people here in Palestine move forward. And we cannot do that on the bedrock of bigotry.
Thank you so much for that incredibly clarifying and just like deep analysis of what it means to understand what the links between white supremacy and anti-Semitism right now. I really, really appreciate that. Rabbi Jacobs, is there anything you'd like? I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Eric said and really appreciate your brief history of anti-Semitism. I'll just add a couple of things and then talk about how anti-Semitism is showing up in this particular moment around the war between Israel and Hamas. So first of all, as you said, the term anti-Semitism emerged in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, and as a way to take anti-Semitism out of the religious sphere and into what was considered racial. I want to say that's problematic language, but again, this is the language that's coming from the people who coined that term and that idea. So if we just go way back, the earliest anti-Semitism probably actually started in ancient Egypt, which was the first diaspora Jewish community, even while the temple was still standing in Jerusalem. But really, anti-Semitism really got going with the rise of Christianity, particularly when Christianity also acquired power through the conversion of the Roman Empire. And the question that Christianity had to answer was, why are Jews still around? Because if Christianity superseded Judaism, and if the New Testament, which we would call it the Christian Bible, but in the Christian conception, if the New Testament must have superseded the Old Testament, again, that's not the term we use, would say Tanakh or Hebrew Bible. But then what are Jews still doing here, and what should we do with them? And lots of debates about that. Famously, St. Augustine saying, slay them not, which was kind of a nice way maybe of keeping us alive, but also not so nice, because the implication or the view that's presented there is, look, we're not going to kill them, but they're essentially here as a reminder, as a warning to us. And in Christianity, has still superseded Judaism, etc. And they're kind of this remnant that is warning us of to do the right thing, specifically to be Christian in that conception. And then as anti-Semitism develops, it develops all sorts of different tropes and ideas. You mentioned Jews as the devil, Jews as somehow subverting Christianity, desecrating the host, murdering Christian babies, right? All of these different ideas develop, but later, fast forward in the middle of the 19th century, what's going on? So a lot of things are going on. One, we're in the age of revolution. So starting from the French Revolution, the end of the 18th century, a lot of Western Europe starts emancipating its Jews. So Jews are suddenly getting new political rights, or some rights of worship, land owning, ability to access certain professions. It's different, of course, in every place, but Jews are slowly being emancipated and gaining more rights, which is extremely scary to some people, because now we don't even know who they are. And in some cases, some Jews were even converting to Christianity. And the other thing that's happening, of course, the Enlightenment means that there's many philosophers, thinkers who are not basing their worldview on Christianity anymore. So they also need a non-religiously based basis for anti-Semitism. Poof, brilliantly, not brilliantly, but some anti-Semites come up with what they think is a very scientific way to hate Jews that's based in, as you said, race, the idea that Jews are this foreign race that terrifyingly is like nefariously, sneaking into society, hidden. We don't know who they are, and they're gonna just take over Germany and other places. This really very much comes up around the new German constitution, which includes more emancipation for Jews. Again, it kind of varies by the particular place you're in, but that's too much detail. So that's what happens. And I want to say really clearly, I mean, you said this clearly, and I'll just say again that sometimes we hear the language of, well, Arabs are also Semites, or Palestinians or Arabs can't be anti-Semites because they're Semitic, or actually the Zionists are the real anti-Semites. Right? We hear that kind of language, and it's just really important to say that anti-Semitism is a word that means hatred of Jews. And we know it's a strange word. We know that it's a word made up by anti-Semites themselves. It is the word. There's other words you can use. You can talk about Islamophobia. You can talk about anti-Arab racism, but anti-Semitism is the hatred of Jews. That's what it means. And also, like you said, it very often manifests as a conspiracy theory. That is one of the primary modes that anti-Semitism expresses itself since, as you talked about, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, this giant conspiracy theory. And we see that very much now. Certainly we saw it, as you mentioned, in Charlottesville and in Pittsburgh, this idea that Jews will not replace us, Jews trying to replace real white Christian Americans. It's, as you referenced, a way to be simultaneously anti-Semitic and racist, because this idea that in the civil rights movement, it couldn't have been Black people organizing themselves. It must have been the Jews. So you get a double bigotry there. And Pittsburgh, as we know, the murderer in Pittsburgh went into that synagogue because they were celebrating Refugee Shabbat. And he believed that Jews are conspiring to bring in brown immigrants to replace real white Americans. And I hope if anybody's just listening by phone, you saw that I have quotes around the real part. I don't want to be misquoted on that. So that is often how anti-Semitism shows up, as that conspiracy theory. And it's showing up, and I want to say also just one more thing before I talk about how it's showing up now. As Eric, as you also mentioned, anti-Semitism is a real threat to democracy. So it would be enough to fight anti-Semitism just to protect Jews, of course, just like it's enough to fight racism, to protect people of color and sexism and homophobia, et cetera, et cetera. And also, if we ignore anti-Semitism, then we are putting our democracy at risk. Because, and particularly when there's times of turmoil, political, economic turmoil, it's very easy to say, oh, well, that's the fault of the Jews, and people are inclined to believe that, and that stops us from making other kinds of efforts to actually create a fair democratic system. And I just want to quote something that I just find, I don't know, tragic. So in 1937, there was an essay contest to write essays about how to end anti-Semitism in America. And these essays were published in a book. And one of the essays that won a prize was by Rabbi Joshua Trachtenberg, who went on to write The Devil and the Jews, a really classic book about anti-Semitism. And so this is 1937. And his essay was titled Stop Fascism, Preserve Democracy. And he wrote there, the attack upon the Jew is the entering breach in the wall of American liberties. We must be prepared, et cetera, to utilize every available weapon against the fascist and anti-Jewish menace, and all not to protect Jewish rights, but to protect American rights. And unfortunately, that still rings very true, this idea that anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine to destroying democracy. And as you said, it also breaks up progressive movements, because if you can convince people that their problem is Jews and not capitalism and not corporate powers and not policies, et cetera, then it makes it much harder to organize. Okay, so I want to say a word about how it's showing up now. I'm sure we'll go much more in depth. So anti-Semitism is all purpose. Jews can be both the Bolshevik and the capitalist, whichever side you're on, then Jews are controlling the other side. It's just very flexible. And so that means that it emerges in white nationalism, and it also does emerge in some parts of the whether we call it pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel world. Now, I want to be really clear that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism, just like criticism of the United States is not anti-American. If you want to criticize the Chinese genocide of Uyghurs, that doesn't mean that's not anti-Chinese, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, etc. You can criticize countries based on their human rights record. And it's also true that sometimes the criticism of Israel does cross the line into anti-Semitism, and that happens when you're using classic anti-Semitic tropes or caricatures. It happens when you're, for example, that Jews are calling Jews bloodthirsty, or using like cartoons with people with big noses and things like that. When you're saying that Jews have outsized power, suggesting that Israel somehow has more power, or is like somehow controlling the world, using those tropes of the octopus is the very classic one. When you deny Jewish history in the land, when you say things like the alleged temple, or Jews are one that gets thrown around a lot these days is today's Jews are not real Jews, they're descendants of Khazar converts, saying, first of all, somebody who converts to Judaism is 100% a Jew, just like somebody who's born a Jew. And that particular theory about Jews being descendants of the Khazar king is just an anti-Semitic lie, and it has just which just needs to be rejected entirely. And also the one that we are seeing a lot, unfortunately, is the justification of violence against Jews, justification of violence against Israelis, who, by the way, are not all Jewish, but mostly Jewish, and also any suggestions that Jews in Israel should leave and go somewhere else, any desire to create a Jewish refugee issue. So I'm going to stop there. I'm also going to see that I can see flashes that people are directly chatting me. I'm not reading them because I can't read and talk or pay attention. So if you have questions or want to, then you should chat the Trua Tech, right? Or the Trua co-host. Yeah. So just to know, if you're chatting me, I am not looking at them because I can't multitask like that.
Great, thank you. And I think you set the foundation so beautifully for the next topic I'd love for us to explore, is that many of us were disappointed to see known anti-Semite and other people who spew homophobia and Islamophobia and other forms of hatred and bigotry invited to speak at Tuesday's Rally for Israel. Can you all speak a little bit about how anti-Semitism intersects with white supremacy, as Eric, you spoke so beautifully on earlier, and how Christian nationalism plays a role into this, and the links between those choices and perpetuating anti-Semitism? Eric, I'd love to start with you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to speak to this question. So the first piece you have to know from my perspective, right? So this is my individual opinion as a person who has attended. I went to my first white nationalist meeting to monitor one in 1992, right? So I have spent extensive time with white nationalists. I don't think many folks on this call can make that claim, or would desire to make that claim, right? I have written and studied it. And I want to be clear about one thing. In my opinion, there's no difference between a Christian nationalist and a white nationalist. Christian nationalism is based off of the beliefs of the centrality of whiteness, right? Christianity is merely one vehicle upon which white nationalists move their policies, right, and move their vision. And I have to say, it was absolutely disappointing, right, and unacceptable for John Hagee, as one example, to be a speaker at that rally. And I would condemn it in the same way that I condemn when on our own side, right, individuals are invited who are spouting anti-Semitism. Look, I want to be clear. There is no room, right, in our coalitions for individuals who believe that there are populations in our society who do not have the same inherent rights as the rest of us, That is the dividing line in this country. That should be the dividing line globally. It's not about left or right. It's not based off of religion. It is about those of us who believe in inclusion and equity, right? Versus those who believe in exclusion and inequity. And in that way, John Hagee has no platform. An individual who has blamed the LGBTQ community for climate crisis, right? Who has supported attitudes of anti-blackness, right? And who has been blamed Catholics, right, for the murder and the destruction of Jews. I can be very plain about this. But now I want to call folks in, right? Many of us will now use that as a way to deny that anti-Semitism exists within our own movements and within our larger society. We're not using it to draw a moral line against bigotry. We are focusing on it to draw a political point, right, in our arguments and in our debates, right? The truth is that's not serious leadership. Serious leadership, right, holds people accountable because we are trying to move towards a society and a world where everyone can live, love, worship free from bigotry, fear in their daily lives. I want to just be really plain because it's very serious. The last thing I'll say is we should understand, right? People make terrible coalitions all the time. We could have an entire webinar. I come out of the progressive movement, out of the racial justice movement. I could spend 5 hours talking about the terrible coalition partners that we have chosen to work with historically, right? And sometimes in the present day. People make bad decisions. They should be held accountable for those bad decisions. But just because we've made bad decisions within the racial justice movement at times, does not in any way remove the reality that we must address racism in American society. And a bad decision at a rally, right, does not mean, and trust me, it was a bad decision, does not remove our responsibility to address the very real anti-Semitism that too often is driving our conversations and our actions as leaders.
Thank you, Rabbi Jacobs.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to just reiterate, John Hagee had no place being at that rally. We didn't know. We had actually heard that he had been floated as a speaker and nixed a week before. And so we didn't know until really the night before that he had been put back on. There were very real information about the speakers didn't come out until very close to the rally. So he had no business being there. And, the rally was, the Jewish community was just shattered on October 7th. Israel, both Jews and non-Jews living in Israel, and also the Jewish community around the world. And it was an important moment for Jews to come together around where we can unite. Specifically, bringing back the hostages. That should be something that not only Jews, but the whole world should be behind. Kidnapping civilians is a war crime, and it's horrible. And I know many of us just wake up every morning thinking about the people, including tiny babies and children, who are held in God knows what conditions, including a very elderly man who a video was just released that makes us all worry about his life. So bringing back the hostages, which I would say was the bulk of the signs that I saw at the rally, and the bulk of the chanting was "Bring them home." And of course, the most powerful voices were the families, who I don't even know how they have the strength to be able to speak in this moment, but they spoke beautifully and compassionately and humanly, to stand, the language of stand with Israel, which we can talk about. What does it mean to stand with a country? I'll say that for me, it's about standing with Israelis, who are both Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel in this horrible moment, and standing against anti-Semitism, which unfortunately has been on the rise. That said, it was a rally that was planned by organizations that are more to the right than where Trua and many of our partners stand on Israel. And some of the speakers, included, they wanted to have bipartisan leaderships that included Mike Johnson, who is an election denier and who also shouldn't have a space in any Jewish space. And then, as we said, unforgivably, John Hagee, who is trafficked in homophobia and racism and Islamophobia and even anti-Semitism. And I want to say specifically sexism. I'm sure I missed a few isms in there. And I want to say that it was insulting and for a number of reasons. I want to say specifically the Jews who were assembled there, like any Jewish community, was very diverse, and of course includes many, many LGBTQ Jews, and is just horrific that Hagee is invited into that space in a way that is extremely disrespectful to LGBTQ Jews, including, I want to say, LGBTQ Israelis who were murdered on October 7th. And second, of course, it's he has made specifically anti-Semitic statements, and also his brand of so-called support for Israel is based in a Christian supersessionist theology that wants to see Jews all come to Israel in order to bring about his messianic fantasies, and I don't want to be pawns in somebody else's supersessionist theology. So that is in itself anti-Semitism, let alone the specific anti-Semitic statements that he's made. And of course, Islamophobia. The last thing that we need is a message that you have to choose to stand with Jews and Israelis or with Muslims and Palestinians. That is a divisive message. And in fact, as we hear all the time from our human rights partners in Israel, who are, by the way, both Jewish and Palestinian, both citizens and living under occupation, that either Israelis and Palestinians are going to live in that land together or they're going to die in that land together. And right now they're dying in that land. And so we need a message that brings the nuance and that says we need to look toward a better future in which everybody can live in dignity with their human rights, with safety and security. And so that's why the progressive groups in the Progressive Israel Network, of which TRA is a member, came as a peace bloc. So TRA and J Street and Americans for Peace Now and New Israel Fund and National Council of Jewish Women and a number of other organizations that I'm definitely forgetting, came with signs like the one that I was holding, which said, "I stand with Israelis, I stand with Palestinians, I stand with humanity." And we saw many other signs like that, signs saying pro-Israel, anti-Bibi, pro-Palestinian, anti-Hamas, right? Signs that could really hold the complexity of the situation. And unfortunately, Hagee is a divisive figure, not somebody who helps us to hold complexity and to move forward toward a better future for everybody.
Thank you. And it's so powerful to think about the ways in which our rabbis have been showing up all week this week, standing on Monday, praying in front of the Capitol, and also showing up on Tuesday. And it just feels really powerful that we are holding a movement of people that can hold nuance and hold complexity in this moment. So thank you, Rabbi Jacobs, for lifting that up. And I think particularly in tune with what you were saying, one of the live questions right now is connected to free speech, particularly as it relates to the right to protest. And I'd love for you both to talk a little bit about the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, criticism of Israel, and when it does perhaps cross a line and become anti-Semitic. Eric, we'll start with you. Or Rabbi Joe, we can start with you and then we'll go to Eric.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I started talking about this before. So anti-Zionism, when somebody says they're anti-Zionist, I want to know what they mean. And there's a few possibilities for what they might mean. So if somebody says, I don't believe that the state of Israel should have been created, and particularly people who quote some of the early, let's say, early reform thinkers, again, before the state of Israel was actually created, or some of the debates of the late 19th, early 20th century, and say, look, there were all these Jews who were anti-Zionist. Like, okay, that's an interesting conversation for a history class, but at this point, we're talking about an actual state that has 9 million people in it. We're not sitting around in Vienna sipping coffee and talking about what should have happened, right? Like, should the United States have been created? Should European settlers have settled in the United States? Like, maybe not, right? But we can't actually rewind in that way. So that's one option. One option, if people say, well, I'm anti-Zionist, and that means that I believe in one binational state, one democratic state for all its people between the river and the sea, and Palestinians should be safe there, Jews should be safe there. I don't think that's actually rooted in reality, especially after October 7th. I think it's really clear that 2 states is the only possibility um, for actual safety and human rights for both people. But okay, if somebody really truly believes that there can be one binational state, I don't think that's anti-Semitism, as long as they're saying also that Jews can and should be safe there. But the other option is that people say, we're hearing, unfortunately, a lot of this right now. If somebody says, well, anti-Zionism means that all of the Jews should leave and go back to where they came from, which, by the way, as if that were even possible. I mean, many Jews trace their families to the Ottoman Empire and before, right? Like, can't even trace their families. I mean, their families just go back as far as recorded history in that land. And many Jews come from not only Europe, but also Iraq and Yemen and other places. And of course, most Israelis, Jewish and Palestinian, don't have any other passport and live there and have lived there for generations. So if you're going to say, well, the Jews should just leave, and if you're willing to create a 7 million Jewish refugee crisis, that's anti-Semitism. If you're saying that the Jews, if you're justifying violence against Jews, saying that all resistance is justified, saying that trying to say that this was an inevitable result of occupation, which it was not. Hamas has agency. Hamas decided to do this. This was not Fatah. This was not a different group of Palestinians. This was a deliberate decision on the part of Hamas to go in and brutally murder Israeli civilians, and they knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what would happen. Any kind of justification like that, by any means necessary, talking about this as part of of decolonization, that is all anti-Semitism, because that is essentially saying that Jewish lives don't matter, justifying the murder of Jews, or pushing for the expulsion of Jews. So there is a broad range of how one can criticize Israel, just like there's a broad range of how one can criticize the United States or other countries, but it doesn't extend to violence to justifying violence. And the other thing I also just want to say is that we've also seen a lot of attacks on Jewish institutions. A Jewish school in Montreal that has been shot at least 2 times, and a firebombing of a synagogue also in Montreal, graffiti on Jewish buildings, synagogues around the world, and Yiddish Cultural Center in the Bronx, and any kind of, just like we know that if you want to protest the treatment of Uyghurs, you don't take your protest to your local Chinese restaurant or to Chinese Americans, or if you want to protest Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you don't take your protest to Russian Americans or to the local Russian restaurant, or you shouldn't. Also, if you want to protest Israel, you can protest it like a country, but don't take that to Jews. That is anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Eric.
Very good. I think for me, it's important for us to remember 3 things in this moment, right? We should understand that it's important for all of us to always stand against systems of inequality. And any administration, we're talking about Bibi's administration, we're talking about uh, uh, historically in any other country, right? I call on all folks to always set yourself apart from systems that are created that seek to establish inequality. That's what it means to be a human rights activist. Also, to be quite plain, right? I'm a peacemaker. I haven't always been a peacemaker. All right. I've written about this and I've spoken about this. I come out of a music subculture that put me inside of what we would now call paramilitary impacted communities or gang impacted communities. Right? I was forced to defend myself physically from individuals who believed I didn't have a space within my punk music community. That is not me. I'm a peacemaker. I understand actually the impact of violence. And I also understand that in the midst of violence, it is nearly impossible to solve issues of inequality. And that's why you have heard me call, right, for the cessation of violence universally, right, within that region For us, it may be an intellectual exercise, right? But for many people who live in Israel and many more who live in Palestine, right, in the Gaza and West Bank, this is a day-to-day reality around burying their dead. And can the rest of us, for a second, just stop what we are doing and realize, right? Are we really helping people in this moment, or are we just having an intellectual debate that feeds and excites our adrenaline rushes? The difference in how we answer that question, right, is the difference around whether we are showing up in real leadership in this moment or not. So for those of us who are showing up in real leadership, who aren't seeking to walk around and be walking memes, I will say this. The first is to understand and continue to push for the cessation of violence in that region from all sides. We do not need to be particular. The second is to continue to demand systems of equity as we do here in our own country. But the next layer is to recognize, right, that there are also things we need to contend with right here in the United States as a result of this global conflict, right, and global discussion and mobilization. The first is we are dividing the united front against authoritarianism here in the United States, right, through irresponsible rhetoric and irresponsible language. The relationships that we break in this moment are not so easily repaired. And all of us should understand that those carry long-term risk for vulnerable communities right here in the United States. I'm not telling people what to do, but I am telling you, you must hold that in mind. The second, realize that our irresponsible rhetoric and language, right, is feeding into an environment that allows other people to believe that they have the right to act out in acts of violence and physical harassment and intimidation of Jewish, Muslim, and Arab communities. We've had an 8-year-old kid who was stabbed to death. We had a Arab American doctor who we're not sure of, but was possibly killed in a hate crime, stabbed to death while she was sitting at a picnic table. We had another Jewish man who was beaten to death at a protest who fell because he was hit in the head. We will see the results, but who died at a protest. We've had individuals who have been struck by vehicles, who have been physically assaulted on their way to and from houses of worship, attacked on their own streets. And I want people to understand this very clearly. Do not see those acts of violence as separate from the ways that we are choosing to speak in this moment. We are also responsible for setting that climate of hate. The third is this. In this emotive moment, we have to be cautious about the closing of public debate and space, right? We are doing something that the Trump administration attempted to do for 4 years, to shut down debate on college campuses, to shut down protests on the streets, right? To shut down civil society. And I want people to understand, as we are going around and doxing one another, costing each other jobs, and when I say we, right, I mean specifically the human rights movement, the racial justice movement in civil society in this moment. As we are moving around and acting in these ways, we should understand there are long-term consequences. We are setting the stage for likely another authoritarian regime that is on the verge of taking power in this country, right? To shut down the right to protest in ways we cannot imagine. There are layers to this conversation. And what I'm primarily asking folks in those three things, right? Watching our rhetoric, do not destroy the united front. Be responsive in tapping down our rhetoric so we're not feeding a cycle of political violence and hate violence. And three, do not make calls of censorship, right, that seek to punish people because they hold a different political position. If we don't do these three things, I promise you, as that person who attended his first white nationalist movement meeting in 1992, there will be serious consequences here at home for our immigrant communities, Muslim communities, African American communities, women, the LGBTQ community, and others. We have to be responsible. We cannot oversimplify this moment. We need to speak to our values. But again, responsibility. We should be held accountable for being irresponsible as civil society leaders in this moment.
Thank you. What a powerful place to end this discussion today. I'm thinking about your words and Rabbi Jacobs' words in conversation with what the Talmud teaches about the obligation to protest. And it teaches that if one sees their neighbor doing something sinful, they have the obligation to protest and to speak out against them. And if they don't, they're actually also liable and culpable to that sin. And thank you so much to both of you for uplifting for us the real obligation and the stakes of what it means to speak out against anti-Semitism and how anti-Semitism plays out in broader white supremacy and other forms of hatred. So it was really, really a pleasure and deeply meaningful to learn from both of you today. We'd love for each of you, we're going to post a survey in the chat. If you're able to take 60 seconds to just provide some feedback on this experience and what other learning experiences might be meaningful in the future, we'd love to hear from you. And this is one of many conversations that we at Trua are having about this moment. Coming up this Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern time, we're going to be having a conversation about what does it mean to have conversations across generations and political differences. And we are going to just continue this conversation together. And what does it mean to hold nuance, to hold each other accountable, to still staying in solidarity and to supporting each other and to caring for those in our community. I wanted to again just thank Eric and Rabbi Jacobs so much for your words today. I want to thank Shira Danan, Rabbi Matt Dreffen, Maddie Spector, Rachel Lerner, Sarah Novick, and Rabbi Lev Meyerowitz Nelson for their staff support today in putting this webinar together. And thank you to all of you for being here. We see your questions in the chat, and I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to them, but they are incredibly helpful in helping us shape what continuing conversations look like going forward. So thank you all for being here, and Shabbat Shalom.